Hey everybody, welcome to my little show on edible landscaping using the EONS methods. My name is Nate Miller, and what we're going to do is we're going to go through the book that I published last year on my development of a landscape theory that's 10 years in the making, and a little bit about myself, and we'll talk about a little bit more about my autobiography and my introduction. But I'm from Virginia, and I'm streaming for you live from the Shenandoah Valley. And I grew up here in Rockingham County. I went to high school in Eastern Mennonite High School in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Then I graduated and went on to Bridgewater College, where I got an art degree and a concentration in environmental science. My childhood was spent many hours in the gardens and gardening with my parents, my neighbors' gardens, and exploring the JMU Arboretum, where I was doing some work under a renewable energy grant. And I also spent a lot of time out in the mountains of Virginia and also some of the remnant areas of natural areas, such as the 1% of wet prairie left out here in the Shenandoah Valley, and would explore the insects, the floras, the fauna, and the salamanders, the frogs, and the birds too. And so my life is steeped in the natural wonders of the world, and also trying to provide sustenance for myself and others through landscaping. So after Bridgewater College, I was trying to figure out what to do. So I spent a year trying to figure out how I can combine art and science, and that led me to the career of landscape architecture. And two seminal projects in college that set me on this track was doing the World Trade Center and the Flight 93 memorials. I didn't win the competition, but I am one of the youngest people to have done a project for the memorials. And if you are able to, you might be able to see the plans that I put forth in the archives of the World Trade Center or in the Flight 93 memorial, which are currently now open to the public. During that time where I was trying to figure out life and the career in landscape architecture, I applied to grad school and I got into Clemson University in South Carolina. So for about 4 years, I spent those years learning the crafts and tools of the trade. I took a lot more horticulture classes than some of the typical landscape architects because my interest lied in the plant and using the plant material, particularly native plants and edible plants, and creating landscapes around this. And that formed the basis of my book, which at the time I didn't know. And also, I was working with a good friend of mine and co-collaborator who collaborated on the book with me, Genesis Johnson. We actually redid her landscape in South Carolina, and you will be able to see that in the book. And it's actually an example that you can use if you happen to be in Zone 7 in the South. After Clemson, I went to work for James Madison University on renewable energy and research, particularly on solar and wind, and also community outreach, whether that be opening the first electric car charging station in Harrisonburg, Virginia, or doing community garden work with a group known as the Valley Crop Mob. And that stint only lasted 2 years because it was a grant-funded job. And if you know anything about grant-funded jobs, they typically do not last long. So fortunately, during the time, Piedmont Virginia Community College, which is the logo on this hat you see here, was in need of a horticulture professor. So in that need, I applied for the job, and I have been teaching horticulture ever since then. That was 2013. And it has now moved to a workforce, but we are still more or less teaching the same amount of horticulture classes, and we'll be expanding as well. I also got hired at Messer Landscapes. At the same time, I was working on my own landscaping through my company, Simply Sustainable. And Messer is located in Stanton, Virginia. So anybody that's in the Stanton, Harrisonburg, Lexington, or Monterey area, we would be glad to do any landscape for you. And you can look us up online. A new development at Piedmont Community College is I am going to be teaching Virginia's first basic introduction to cannabis class in the college system. As far as I know, no other college or university is teaching a basic cannabis course for, in our case, workforce, but for the general public. So that will be an exciting new development in 2022. And I was also interviewed on the Jerry Miller Show in Charlottesville. So that's a little bit about me, and we will move on to the book. So the genesis of this book, a little play on Genesis's name, was she and I were both going to graduate school together. And at the time, we were just young and trying to figure out what do we want to do with our lives. And we thought something to combine all the knowledge we had at Clemson was to create a book of our experiences working in the landscape and coming up with a plan as how can we, beyond our own landscapes, create a template for a new form of landscape design. And that's how we arrived at the EONS theory, which we'll go into depth a bit later. But just for now, the EONS theory basically states, and it's an acronym, and the acronym actually came to me in a dream, funny enough. My best ideas typically come in dreams. And E stands for edible plants, so that means plants that you can eat. O stands for ornamental plants, so favorite heirloom plants like grandmother's irises or Aunt Bee's favorites, snapdragons, but nothing invasive like English ivy or Japanese stiltgrass. And native stands for native plants, and there's many levels and degrees as to what native means, but in general, native to your area. And S is a catch-all term for anything that's a sustainable method. It could be drip irrigation, it could be companion planting, it could be a greenhouse, it could be using solar or wind to power your home. And that sort of ties everything that you'd want in a sustainable landscape into a nice little, easy to remember package. So we're going to go on to the introduction here. So the inspiration for the book was 10 years in the making. And so you might be wondering, what was it that triggered me in Genesis to start this book? And what we had was, there was a class in our horticulture class that we needed to do a project for. So this couple named the Petties came to us and had a large property outside of Clemson, South Carolina, in the town of Central. And they had a ton of land that needed to be landscaped. They came to us in the horticulture class to figure out, well, what can you as students do for us? So Genesis and I decided to join forces. And first, we looked at the site and we looked at the property to see what was on there. There was mountain views, there was fields, there were forests, there was rivers and creeks nearby. And we also took stock of what native plants were there as well. So we kind of did a pictorial evaluation of the landscape. After this, we developed a plan for the landscape, as you can see here, written out as to just generally what we thought the parcels of land could be. So we thought we needed a wildflower meadow for pollinators to pollinate the landscape and the crops. We needed a large area for grains so that the petties who specifically wanted to do some baking, they came to us and said we would really like to be able to have our own bread. So in order to do that, you need a couple acres of grains to successfully do that. So we cordoned off a part of the landscape for grains. And then we also decided to have an area for what will be known as the backyard bilo garden, with a greenhouse and compost bins and chicken coops, as well as some beehives nearby. The petties had children, so we also designated an area for play and recreation. So this is sort of our concept plan. And here's what we came up with. You can see this idea of the backyard bilo. So what does backyard bilo mean? Backyard bilo basically refers to the idea of creating a landscape that's essentially like a grocery store. The bilo is actually a southern chain of grocery stores, and I believe the Carolinas, Georgia, and I think Tennessee as well. And we were sort of doing a play on words with this that would be kind of catchy and also capture our idea of being self-sufficient with the landscape. So here you can see we divided up the landscape into these fun gardens like the tea garden, the sweet potato garden, the Italian garden for Italian meals, and so forth. And we did some 3D renderings so the petties could actually walk through a sort of video game of their landscape as if they were walking through. So the project basically also stemmed our idea of creating some way to document these projects that we were thinking of or had been doing at this point. And we thought that the idea of an edible landscape with a combination of native plants would be a very nice idea and marketable, particularly in the South where you have long growing seasons. Genesis's garden was the next thing we worked on after the Petty residence plan, who, by the way, the Petty residence, Petty has actually, unfortunately, decided to go with another plan, but they were very appreciative of the ideas that we offered. A portion of the landscape we actually did with the EONS theory, or what would soon become the EONS theory once we had a name for it. And we planted all edible plants like tea camellias and bee balm, strawberry trees, blueberry bushes, and we were trying to combine all that together in this theory that we were developing. And here you see me in my own backyard with some of the native plants alongside me. So the purple flower is New England aster, and the yellow flower is Maximilian sunflower. So I'm trying to turn my parents' yard into a place that's supportive of wildlife. Then the picture on the other side is the project that I did for the World Trade Center back in 2003. So we kind of talked about us a little bit. And one of the books that really inspired us to get started on our own book was Edible Landscaping by Rosalind Creasy. Rosalind Creasy is a well-known author and sort of sets the precedent for edible landscaping with her book, Edible Landscaping, which was published in 1982. And we wanted to expand on her ideas of making a garden that has curb appeal, but also has the fun of being edible and attracting wildlife as well, and having symbiosis. And we were also thinking about the wellness of gardening, the psychological benefits, and how it ties communities together. So if you think maybe you have extra potatoes, well, and you need to give them away, you can give them to your next door neighbor. Or maybe your neighbor has extra apples, you can give those to somebody else as well in the neighborhood. Sort of a bartering system without even having to use money because there's more than enough for everybody. So we did a lot of research. We went to libraries, we went and looked through magazines and looked through a lot of the literature that we had available at the time. So we thought some rock solid literature on the status of food and also wildlife would be important for the book. So here you can see some of our research. We looked at animal extinctions. We looked at the changes in seed type biodiversity, specifically in vegetable crops. We also looked at biodiversity again, the decline in songbirds and monarch butterflies, which are making a lot of the headline right now. As you know, about several billion birds have since passed in population since 1970. So we are on a dramatic decline, and you've probably heard of the sixth greatest extinction, this Anthropocene or human-induced extinction. A lot of it done by climate change and also habitat destruction. So another person that published a book at about the same time was Bringing Nature Home. This was from Doug Tallamy. We used him as also an inspiration for this book as well. And here's some ideas. So an EONS garden right here, using the edible herbs and in the mix, and a hemlock forest as the reasoning for saving keystone species. We also took a look at all the zones and the topography in the landscape. As you can see here, we are focusing on the southeast, so Virginia, the northern Virginia suburbs of DC and near DC, down to Tennessee, over to the Mississippi River, down to Mississippi, and northern Florida. Florida itself would be its own book because there's many different ecotypes and ecosystems within Florida itself. But we're taking northern Florida because it's much like the Alabama and Georgia nearby. We also looked at topography. There's a lot of geography to look at in the southeastern region, as you can see, beyond what we might have learned in high school or earlier about just the coastal plain, the Piedmont, and the mountains. There's a lot of different smaller ecosystems and ecotypes in between, such as the sand hills and the Highland Rim if you're in the Nashville area. And this also helps you in thinking about what can I plant in my given zone and given the area that I'm working in. Am I in the mountains? Am I in the coastal plains? Am I in the Highland Rim, etc.? We also look at population. Population is rapidly growing in the southeast, as you probably have noticed, particularly in the Raleigh area where the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association event usually happens in the fall. Here you can see, just taking Raleigh for instance, the blue bar is 1960, the red bar is 1990, and the green bar is 2010. That was our most recent data we had at the time. And tremendous growth, especially in northern Virginia, as you can see in Fairfax County, the DC suburbs. But a lot more people are moving into the southeast. And these are also diverse populations of people as well, who are moving from other countries, particularly Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, and adding to a very rich and culturally diverse population in some of these areas. And they're bringing their ideas of gardening and the foods that they enjoy from their countries as well, changing the palate of the Southeast. And you can see we've been heading towards more of a suburbanized nation as the population has grown through the years. So there are many ways to define sustainability. And so we're thinking about the idea of sustainability along the lines of Olivia Sprinkle, a well-known blogger, which sustainability is a balance between the financial, the human, and the environmental. It's about living your values and acting with integrity, responsibility, and generosity. And it's about being a community of discussion, of dialogue, and action. So basically, a holistic approach to the land and how we're using the land and what the repercussions of changing the land might be. And we need to think of the globe, not just the Southeast as a community, whether we're talking about people or ecosystems or the land we're using, but we need to think about this in terms of the world as well. What we're doing can impact, people around the globe, particularly pollution, as you are familiar with. So what we're trying to do with the EONS theory is reducing the aims of too much reliance on the grocery stores for food, using farmers markets where we can, but primarily growing as much as we can on the landscapes that we have available to us, whether it be a balcony or a 2-acre plot. And we're trying to basically get rid of the 3,000-mile Caesar salad, or at least lessen it to some extent because of the travel times and the costs, the environmental costs of that. So here's a picture of the Valley Crop Mob, as I had talked to you about in the introduction. And what this is a group of basically students that would go help farmers and permaculturalists and people locally with the projects and tasks that they just didn't have time to do but needed help. And so we would be there on the double on a weekend to help them out. And it created a great sense of community. So EONS theory is also re-examining the typical American landscape. As you can see, we've been basically turning much of the landscape into concrete, prefab homes and lawns. So what are we going to do to try to mitigate this? We're going to try to rewild and re-landscape the areas that are mostly just bland monocultures of grass and non-native plants into diversity, whether it's native plants or edible plants, and creating a sense of beauty and curb appeal, while also being a sustenance landscape for both us as people and also wildlife. As you can see here, a monarch butterfly, and we need to also learn about this picture of the monarch butterfly and the milkweed, learning about the relationships of the wildlife and our landscape and the plants that we're choosing, because you can't have monarch butterflies without having milkweed, at least the caterpillars. And here's some stats on the use of the land and how we're pretty wasteful with our use, particularly in watering. We waste a lot of money on these manicured lawns. So I say, let's ditch the lawns, let's get ground covers, let's garden, let's put more trees and shrubs where we can. We also are worried about climate change and what that's going to do. It's going to shift the zones north. We know that. We also know that the weather is also going to become more erratic. As you've noticed within the last 5 years, we've had some pretty erratic weather here in Virginia and in the Carolinas. We've had some extreme droughts. We've had some surprise freezes. We've had floods and hurricanes that are getting worse and more impactful. And in addition to that, we're losing the coastline too. It's going underwater from saltwater intrusion, and also the sea is reclaiming a lot of that lower lands, the lower lands, like in lowlands of South Carolina and the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And in places like Norfolk and Virginia Beach, you have clear days where there's actually water flooding the roads in some of those low-lying areas, even though there's no storm. So we need to be mindful of that. And how are we going to adapt to these changes? And we want to emphasize native plants. One thing people have talked about in native plant circles is this idea of nativars, which is a native cultivar versus straight species. I will say, as a landscaper, I always try to go for the straight species first. If I can't, I will go for the nativar, which is just as good. But some nativars are better than others. And getting to know your local landscapes. If you're in Tennessee, I would highly recommend going up to Roan Mountain, or North Carolina for that matter, and getting inspiration from the landscapes up in the mountains there, such as the Roan Mountain Rhododendron Gardens, which is a gorgeous place to be in June and July. And of course, we know there's pitfalls along the way. Gardening is a learning process, as anything else in life. I learned from planting mint without basically corralling it in with a container or keeping it out of the main garden bed because it would take over. So a lot of gardening is trial and error. There is no hard and fast rules to some things. And so here's the EONS theory and a lovely, with the acronyms, all lovely tied up in a nice pictorial image. And so some of our inspirations for the landscape theory came out of reading about landscaping in Europe, Central America, and Asia, and also the Native Americans as well. We picked up on some ideas such as the Three Sisters method of gardening and applying that to the landscape. So it wasn't just me and Genesis and our own experiences within our own landscapes, but also learning from the literature and the history of the landscape as well, and the history of American landscaping. And here's an example project. This is a Japanese style garden in Kieseltown, Virginia. And as you can see, we have native plants such as the button bush alongside edible / ornamental plants such as the Kusa dogwood with a Zen garden. So you still have that Japanese aesthetic of meditation, but you also have native plants tucked in as well as edible plants for a very unique experience in a garden that most people don't think of a Japanese garden as being an edible or native plant garden, but it is possible to do it. But you can't forget the Japanese maples, of course. I think they're a mainstay. And we wrote this book for a hope for change, so that hopefully if you buy this book, you will get inspired to do your own landscaping or inspire others to do edible native EONS landscapes as well. So we're going to switch over to the history section, which I think is very important. So the next chapter in the book is Landscape History of America. And I will talk about this while it's loading. Learning the history about where we've come from and how gardening has changed in America is very important to understanding how the landscape is today as we see it today and why. And so a lot of people question, why is there a history section in the book? And our reasoning is for those very reasons I just stated. I think it's basically about getting to know your roots, learning why things are the way they are, and when do they happen. So we start with the Native Americans, because they were some of the first people here on the North American continent, and they were the first people to change the landscape in a way. And some of the things that they did was create burial mounds and effigies. An effigy is a religious area. As you can see here in the pictures, that's the Rock Eagle Mound, which is known as an effigy. It's a religious area that has symbolic meaning. Some of these places we're still trying to determine what that meaning would be. In some places we may never know because a lot of the information is lost to time. But we do know that the burial grounds, such as the ones in Etowah, the Etowah Mounds in Cartersville, Georgia, had people actually buried in the mounds along with ice. And we can also determine what plants they were using because some of those items were actually seeds and gourds and things that, and remnant pollen grains that we can understand as having significant importance to the diet of the Native Americans that were in these burial grounds, and also the type of trading of plant material that was going on at the time. And we're learning in our modern times through literature and more widely available articles on how was gardening done by the Native Americans. And two ones that I know of that are familiar to me that I've learned is the Medicine Wheel and the Three Sisters Garden. The idea of the Three Sisters Garden is basically creating sort of a self-contained ecosystem for three edible plants. And each of these plants has a significant reason as why they're planted next to each other. So the corn provides structure for the beans. So corn will be one. Beans would be the next. So the beans would crawl up the corn because it would act as sort of a stake or sort of lattice work. And the beans also provide a service for all the plants because it puts nitrogen back into the soil. The squash or pumpkins were planted as natural mulch when the leaves broke down, as well as shade for the roots of all the plants too, and keeping the water in as well. So you have a very nice contained system. And this idea of the Three Sisters Garden has been expanded into permaculture into the concept of guild gardening, which is a whole other discussion in and of itself. But we also take note of the guild gardening as well in our landscapes. The Medicine Wheel gardening has religious and there's symbolic references to it. So basically, think of a circle. It's divided into 4 parts: red, white, yellow, and black. Each of those colors has a significance religiously and ceremoniously. And the plants also have their uses tied to those colors as well. So that's how a Medicine Wheel garden is divided up into. And I believe it comes from the Navajo tradition. I don't quote me on this, but I know it's from the West primarily, but I think it's Navajo. So now we have colonialization, and this is when we get European influence on the landscape. And basically, some of the first landscapes were all about survival and rudimental gardening. Such if you think about Jamestown, you think about Plymouth, Massachusetts, St. Augustine, Florida. A lot of those gardens at that time were just simply bringing over what little they had from the old world to try to survive off of, as well as while they were learning the new botanical plants in the new world. So it's kind of a cross of both, but primarily using things that were familiar to them from the old world. At the same time, what was going on with the Native Americans, their landscapes were dominated by plants that they were using through trade. And we learned this through the eastern woodland Native Americans in particular, through cave dwellings and paintings. They were using plants in what is called the Eastern Agricultural Complex. And these are plants that are domesticated by the Native Americans, such as lamb's quarters, which we now think of as a weed, but it's highly nutritious. Sunflower comes out of this. The use of the American chestnut, pecans, wild rice, and several berries and beans come out of this tradition of the Eastern Agricultural Complex trade. So as communities get more developed during the colonial period, we see the development of large homes and estate gardens. These eventually become plantations. So I have listed a couple here, such as Stratford Hall on the northern neck of Virginia. You might have been to some of these plantations, such as Boone Hall in Charleston. So you have a large estate home with a plantation owner. Then you also have a kitchen garden off to the side often, and the kitchen is often separated from the house because of fires. At the same time, you also have slave quarters too, with their own gardens. Oftentimes the slaves were able to tend to their own landscapes as well, and were able to have somewhat of a trading, bartering within the community. And a lucky few were able to actually sell produce as well. But it was a hard life. Lots of things were going on at this time. in addition to the genocide of the Native Americans, you have also the terrible treatment of the slaves going on. So we don't want to diminish that at all. As you can see, as I'm scrolling through some of these plantations, such as Drayton Hall and Tuckahoe, you're seeing a lot of European influences, and that's what's dominating the landscape at this time. A lot of traditions are being brought over and taken out of European styles, such as the Dutch, the French, the English, and the Spanish primarily. So you'll see elements of that in these landscapes of this time period. One of the first important, truly Americanized lands would be the William Paca House. I encourage everybody to see this in Annapolis, Maryland. Combines sort of native plants and sort of a hodgepodge of different styles. English estate with sort of the cottage, but also some American elements as well in it. And the founding fathers, such as George Washington, had their own homes, and they were often talking together while they were meeting, trading different ideas within each other. William Bartram was exploring the Southeast and noting the plants that he was finding on his travels through the Carolinas and Georgias at this time, such as the Franklinia tree named for Ben Franklin, which is now extinct. This would have been on the Altamaha River down in southeastern Georgia, I believe. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Quincy Adams had these large estate gardens, and they did a lot of experimentation. And a great book to read up more in depth on this is Andrea Wolf. She wrote an in-depth book on the founding fathers and their gardens and what they're doing and what secrets, often it was little secrets they were trading, such as seaweed used in the garden for fertilizer. As we were expanding into the pioneer territory, you had some of this rudimentary gardening, such as cabins out in the west and in the Appalachian Mountains. Again, just like Jamestown, St. Augustine, and Plymouth, you're pretty much trying to grow a garden for survival. And so there really isn't, aesthetics really isn't taken into account as much as survivability here. The more established areas, such as Edenton, North Carolina at this time, you were having this development of a style and still borrowing from the traditions of a European culture. So I know I'm going to fly through this a little bit because there's a lot to go in here, but I just want to give you an overview. So we are now moving into sort of the Gilded Age. Homes are very opulent, such as the Biltmore Estates mansion and the Mansion Row down in Newport, Rhode Island. See these massive gardens combining some elements of the American landscape along with European styles still. Same with the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts, and several parks and gardens. And now we get to the point in history where we have our first landscape architect. And at this time, this is when we're developing Central Park. Frederick Law Olmsted is the first landscape architect in America, and naming the profession landscape architecture. So he's well known for Central Park and the Chicago World's Fair. So we now have a profession emerging. And so primarily during this time, which is the Gilded Age, up through the Progressive era, you see this dynamic thing of creating municipal parks and public areas. At the same time, you've got a lot of opulent wealth. So what were the common people or the working class at this time? They were borrowing some traditions of both sort of public gardens in some situations. They were also looking to the founding fathers, the large estates, and trying to copy some of that. But by and large, pretty basic landscapes, vegetable gardens, kitchen gardens, a little herb garden, a couple of flowers, a lot of pass-along plants or hand-me-downs, but nothing really opulent. So now we're in the 1900s, the early 1900s. This idea of the public good, municipal buildings and public parks in vogue. You had the 4-H club, the Boy Scouts being developed for the public getting involved in farming. Also, you have wide open spaces. You're getting a more sense of a modern landscape because we're now seeing the invention of the tractor, the cotton gin. They're changing the landscape of the automobile and the airplane. Soon will be changing the landscape. Things are getting faster. Things are getting more modernized. At the time, first environmental laws are being passed. Subdivisions in the suburbs are also becoming developed. So we're being more car and streetcar centric. First with the streetcar and then with the automobile. And Frank Lloyd Wright this time is developing his modernistic natural style. Utilitarian becomes vogue. Utilitarian style, that is. We're developing parkways, enjoying nature beyond the cities, trying to escape, as many people still do, like in the Skyline Drive, Blue Ridge Parkway. And we start developing the idea of sustainable agriculture at this time. And then we move into the 30s and the 40s, where we have Victory Gardens, the Depression, and building gardens for survival and to support the war effort. And by the time we come out of World War I and II, we're into suburbia, developing massive, what we know as the ranch houses and buildings that didn't have a whole lot of attraction. The building was a dominant feature. Landscapes were pretty bland and boring and pretty much green meatballs, as I call them. And then that brings us up to today. We're thinking more along the lines of sustainability, public good, public landscapes that are inviting, that have elements that are exciting to us, such as community gardens, farmers markets. And we're thinking about Earth Day. We're thinking about, ecological villages such as the Twin Oaks and Louisa. Basically, we're thinking about how we can be more impactful on the landscape and work with nature rather than against it. Also creating food, places for food in areas that are food deserts. And that's the idea of the community garden. And of course, community involvement in those sustainability ethics and mindset as well. And our architecture is changing along with that as well. More green, more sustainability. So that's a quick rundown of the history of landscape architecture in America. And there's many more to go, but that could be a whole session. So we're going to go on to the next chapter. One thing that got me in my own path through history of landscape architecture was, ironically, a lot of the media that we had at the time. In the 1990s, we had Captain Planet, we had Bill Nye the Science Guy. I am a millennial, and I'm a product of those TV shows and the inspiration from it. And a lot of the documentaries, we had the Discovery Channel, and Animal Planet came much later. But yes, and I will even say Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was inspiration to me. All those field trips to gardens and parks impacted me as well. So as we're loading chapter 2, I'm just going to talk a little bit about, kind of the format of what I'm going through. This is basically the condensed version, as if I'm a professor teaching you our landscape course at Piedmont Virginia Community College. I'm condensing basically 6 weeks of landscaping knowledge into basically an hour. So there's a lot to learn. I know it's a lot to see and understand, but hopefully I'll be able to answer a lot of those questions in the Q&A, and hopefully you'll understand if you buy the book or take my class if you happen to be in Virginia. So chapter 2, we focus on landscape design. And so what we're basically doing is trying to make the landscape idea that you have become reality. So the long and short of landscape design is basically graphically representing what you want to do to the landscape and the changes you want to do to your landscape as well. So landscaping is divided up into two areas, softscapes and hardscapes. So when you think about softs, you're thinking about bed lines, you're thinking about plant material. Hardscapes would be like patios, sidewalks, things like that. Typically hard surfaces. So in the class, I go through some big concepts, terms, and principles of design, and I think that's important for everybody to know when you're designing your landscape. And here's the list. Some of these are the most frequently encountered. If you've ever taken an art class, or maybe you've taken a design class, these might be familiar terms with you, for you, which I am an art student. So I'm taking what I learned from art school and adapting this to landscape designing. So that's where I'm coming at with these terminology. So you have shape and form, which is you're talking about not only the physical appearance of a plant, but areas such as bed lines and designs. As we load, so here's some of the shapes of the plants, and there's different definitions as to what those plant forms are, as you can see listed here, such as trailing a creeping. Think about a creeping rosemary. What could be a vining plant? Purple passion flower, or is known as the maypop. A lot of people know it as maypop. What could be a cone-like plant? Eastern arborvitae, which you might see as a privacy hedge. That's a great native privacy hedge, by the way. If you've ever seen an American elm, that shape is called a vase-like shape. So there are many different shapes that we use in terminology to describe the plant and what it looks like. Also, we use the term in the forming of bed lines, so the garden bed lines. So you have organic, curvilinear, and geometric. So a curvilinear design would be like in butcher gardens. Here on the right, a lot of ellipses, a lot of circles, a lot of snake-like patterns. A geometric design would be very formal. Think about, a lot of those estate gardens with the hedges and the topiaries. And then an organic design would be up in the top left corner, sort of a natural, plants are allowed to grow as they are in nature. So combining a lot of different plant textures all together creates a lot of visual interest in the garden. So you'll want to create a garden with a lot of different visual interest. So what texture does, it basically describes the plant's visual feel or your sense of touch when you're feeling the plant, such as like the sharpness of the holly needles or the fuzziness of lamb's ear. So arrangement is how we arrange the landscape, and there are different ways to do that. You can do an informal arrangement, which is more natural, as you see in the pictures. Or you can do something more formal, which involves a little more with hardscapes, hard edges, and looks a little bit more like something that would be in a estate sort of situation, or needs to be more neat and tidy. Color is very important in landscape. You want to, especially, and I repeat this a lot, seasonal interest in seasonal color. Thinking about when things flower or fruit, when the leaves fall off, what do the stems and sticks look like in the wintertime. You always want to have some sense of visual interest all through the year, whether it's berries, flowers, stems, leaves, etc. And helpful for me is to create a color wheel and see how you can match colors. As you can see here, I use a color wheel and I put the plant pictures off to the side to sort of say, okay, what can I do? What matches well with purple? Well, yellow does. So maybe if I could time my eggplant to fruit at the same time the Maximilian sunflower is blooming, have a very interesting display. Also, that helps with pollination. The flowering at the time the plants are fruiting, there's probably still going to be more flowers in an eggplant that need some pollination as well. So you're creating a symbiotic relationship, but also visual interest. This will also help you create curb appeal in the landscape, which is very important as well. And there's many different ways. You might have your own personal choice of color palette. I typically think of them as in terms of color schemes. And a color scheme is basically the act of arranging the colors to create a theme or combination. Most people know, so hot would be pinks, oranges, yellows. Whereas a more cool landscape is going to be blues, like here, blues, purples, maybe a lighter pink. And whites often sort of create sort of a filler color in between and sort of create divisions. You can create your own theme. Maybe you want an all-white garden, and that's really spectacular in the moonlight because the white flowers and the variegated leaves set a really interesting tone in the middle of the night with the moonlight shining on them. Or maybe you want to do a monochromatic theme with all yellow, like the daffodils with forsythia. And don't be limited to just typical showy colors we think of as in gardening. You can do an all black theme. Now, black is really actually in the color scheme of plants is dark red or red purples. So it makes it very interesting. You could do white and black and call it a tuxedo garden. That's something unique. Brown could be a interesting monochromatic type of garden. You can even do a white, again, white garden, or a combination of white and black, again. Green could be a unique combination because you can pair up flowering plants that are green alongside of vegetables. And again, that idea of seasonal interest. In the spring, you could have red twig dogwood with daffodils. That would provide an interest in, let's say, March or April. Whereas, and some people don't think about this, it's not just flowers that provide seasonal interest, also fall colors do as well. And what helps me out a lot when I'm planning a landscape is going through the months of the year and just listing out all the plants and their times of interest, like I have done here. And their times to shine, whether it's fruiting, flowering, or leafing out. I go through the entire year that way. And it helps me plan the landscape later on. So I'm just going to briefly go through. So hierarchy is basically you're ranking things. It could be shape, sizes, or color. Scale, you're basically looking at the scale of the landscape and whether it's to the hardscapes, to a building, or also the human element of scale as well. Repetition, so this is very important to think of in landscapes, and a lot of landscapes have this. So you're repeating a pattern or a color over and over and over again, such as a row of arborvitae or red cedars, or a edible hedge with hazelnuts, quinces, and chokeberries and elderberries. Focal point means like a place that you want to focus interest on, or an object such as a fountain or a special plant. And I often use my fingers as kind of to create like a viewfinder of a camera, such as called framing the view. If I want to focus in on a special landscape in the distance, such as a mountain or an ocean. So that concept is called framing the view. And that's under the idea of emphasis, basically getting the viewer's attention. You want to think about symmetry. Is your landscape going to be symmetrical, radial, or asymmetrical? And how are those things balanced? Which that all ties symmetry together. You want to think about space and how things are arranged in your landscape as space. And thinking about background, midground, and foreground as well. So to start a landscape, I would go with the simplicity. Simplicity is the best way to pare things down to some basic elements. From there, maybe you choose 5 or 6 plants and a few hardscapes, and that's what you want to start with. So it's not so overwhelming. And listing out those plant materials and how many things you're going to use. Transition is basically transitions within the landscape. You want to pay attention to the heights, shapes of things, and how they interact. And also proportion, the location or size of the element relative to each other. How does landscape create movement? Maybe you want to lead the viewer's eye, and maybe that's the changes and transition of plant material or hardscapes. Maybe you need to think about dominance. Dominance is like a certain plant or feature on the landscape that everything else should center around or focus on. And opposition and contrast, 2 different things or 2 things that might pull or push at each other, away from each other. And variety is the spice of life. So the more things that you have variety, the more visual interest in your landscape. Unity is something that would tie everything together. It could be a theme, it could be a color, it could be a style. And that often creates harmony or a pleasing arrangement of parts. And gradation is basically the use of objects to change things from light to dark, or different shades of things. It creates different diversity and visually. Rhythm follows repetition in sort of a musical pattern, but you're thinking about that in terms of your eyes, how things move in the landscape visually. And pattern, there's many different ways to create a pattern. Basically, the basic concept of pattern is an underlying structure that ties things together, that unifies everything. So I'm going to briefly take you through how you do a landscape design process. So the process starts with site inventory and analysis. And this is where you start looking at a landscape, taking pictures, and you basically take an inventory and establish goals of the landscape. What do you want to do to it? I would always start with a SWOT diagram, strengths, opportunities, weaknesses, and threats, and go from there. You want to lay out the questions and maybe some considerations about some of those strengths, opportunities, threats, and weaknesses. And you want to think about a lot of things like on your landscape. How's your soil? What is your privacy like? Where's the wind coming from? How much sun do you get? Is there shade? Are there microclimates? Legal considerations like HOAs and zoning laws, and also existing structures. And knowing where your utilities are is very important as well. And maybe you want to write this up in a way that has the pictures with the notes as well. An example could be, where is your wind coming from? Maybe it's blowing from the west. Well, we might want to block out that west wind because it can come across the property and damage, if we have a storm, damage some things. Thinking about where water flows on your property as well. And how I do that is I take a bucket and see where the water flows on the property, and where it collects might be a place for a rain garden, or maybe it's a place where I want to put something that's tolerant of wet soils. Thinking about the views inside and outside the house. Landscape architecture is basically what I consider is exterior landscaping. And thinking about the care of your neighborhood. Microclimates are very, very important in noting like where there might be a small area of wet area, or it could be a colder area in the landscapes, or a hotter area, and knowing what plants you want to put in those areas based on those parameters. So this is what it would look like when you're planning your landscape with all those considerations from the SWOT diagram and the site analysis. So this is your site analysis formed visually as a map, a road map to what you're going to do next in the landscape. And here's some of the symbols that you might use in a site analysis. That brings us to the conceptual diagram. So the conceptual diagram takes those ideas a little further that you learned from visiting the site or being in your site. And you're basically doing some bubble diagrams, and you're trying to figure out, well, maybe I want a screen here. Maybe this area is where people are passing through. You're taking knowledge and notes on where people are moving. What are the spaces used for? Is it a play area? Is it a lawn? And etc. And again, I would do a visual diagram for that too, noting those things, private and public areas, transition zones, and how spaces are used. Circulation is very important as well. You want to consider your spatial edges. How do you define the spaces? And there's many different other questions and considerations you want to ponder as well. And that takes us next to the preliminary plan. So the preliminary plan in a landscape is by putting all those elements that you want in the landscape and just giving them sort of a general area. So you're not actually listing out, I want 5 red bee balm, but you want to say, I want 5 or an odd number of a perennial that blooms in the summer. Don't know what that is, but maybe you do put in that I want it to be red. So it's just a generalized landscape. From there, we move into the master plan. This is your final plan before actually constructing or doing the landscape. You've got a list that specifies what cultivar plants and also how many and possibly what nursery it's come from and also where they're going to be on the landscape. Also what hardscapes you're going to have and also what the materials might be and where you're going to get those from. So this list here is got a good example of what I do when I list out how I'm going to put the plants in the landscape. So I've got my letter on my map. I've got my name of the plant that I want. Let's say it's the purple basil. We're going to go for 6 of those. And I want to make some notes. There might be some important things to consider, like this is an annual. We want to change this out in the fall with something that's parsley. It's a little bit more tolerant of the cold. And it's a biennial, so it will come back fresh in the spring. Always thinking about seasonal interest. And this in the notes column, that's kind of where you want to write that. So some ideas of thinking about where you want to put plants in the landscape. Massing. That's something I constantly do with this particularly large project. Or even small ones, but I want to make groupings of plant material. And this height visual impact also cuts down on weeding and watering and mulching as well. Drifts. These would be like ellipses or swaths of plant material, but you want to think about seasonal interest with this. Maybe you have a swath of daffodils, followed by a swath of black-eyed Susans, and then a swath of asters. So there you have spring, summer, and fall all combined. And maybe the backdrop could be something like blueberry bushes. A specimen plant is a very important plant in the landscape that's usually a focal point. So like here we have a weeping red cherry. You want to put the plant material to kind of emphasize, or even the hardscapes to emphasize on that plant. So maybe making a circular patio with the weeping cherry in a pot with low plantings around the edges of that circular patio that's driving the interest towards the middle of the landscape where the weeping redbud is. Accent plants are plants that heighten interest in the landscape, such as the cup plant here, which is a native plant to the southeast. It's kind of like a sunflower-like plant, but its height will give great visual interest to the landscape. Sort of creates a stair step way of looking at the landscape. What are bedding plants? So bedding plants I use as filler, often whether it's in a EONS landscape or also if I'm doing pots or window boxes. These are mostly annuals, perennials, and biennials that are tender, and they're usually used for temporary displays. And when I mean filler, I mean when the perennials are not, or maybe the vegetables or fruits aren't doing much, it provides a splash of color. Edging and border plants I use to define the spaces between the hardscape or the lawn. Usually these are low plants like the Johnson's blue cranespill, followed by a stair step pattern of landscape material after that. So you have a middle plant like a obedient plant followed by a chokeberry in the background, aronia as people call it, because some people don't like the name chokeberry because they think you're going to choke on it. These are usually large plants in the background, such as Joe Pye weed, something that's tall. Could be a dwarf pomegranate, could be something like that too. Creates a sense of height. Fig trees. There's also the rule of addition by subtraction in the landscape. So what you take out and what you put in will change what the look of the landscape is. But it's also helpful in removing excess material out of the landscape and adding new space for new material. And a lot of people ask me, how do you draw the landscape? And so there are two ways to draw the landscape. You can do a plan view or perspective view, or both. I do both often. Plan view is like if you're in an airplane looking down the landscape, everything looks like circles and squares, more of a diagram. Whereas a perspective view is actually an actual drawing, as if I'm sitting in the garden and I'm drawing what I'm seeing in front of me in a 3D view. And there are many different ways. You can do hand drawing if you're not comfortable with hand drawing. You could do computer. I do a hybrid of both. I will also draw and or do the computer. And there are many different programs. A lot of the industry standards, AutoCAD, but I like real-time landscape architect the best. And I've even used Photoshop as well. And maybe you want to work with your professional. So if you're nervous about doing it yourself, always professional. You can, if you're in Virginia, you can come to us at Messer. We'll help you and make your landscape come true through envisioning and learning about it. And so this part of the book, I'm just going to run through this pretty briefly, is there are 4 example landscapes for each of the zones in the Southeast. Zone 6, so we're thinking about where I'm near, Harrisonburg, Virginia. So this would be more in the mountains. Things like pawpaws. What could you do? Like pawpaws, American hazelnut, the red osier dogwood, the red stem dogwood, bearberry, some of the upland azaleas, high bush blueberry. We could do celery up here because we have a lot more cooler weather and a longer winter. So a lot of our edible plants are going to be shorter lived, particularly because most of them are annuals up here, with the exception of the fruit trees and bushes and nut trees and bushes, of course. So zone 7, this is Genesis's garden. Actually, we've implemented this into the book. This is zone 7. So this would be thinking about the middle of the Piedmont or down into the middle of the DL. So what could you do here? Century agave, rusty blackhaw, American elms. You could do some Japanese akuba for something that's unusual but not invasive. Many different herbs and annual vegetables. And we did canna lilies. Canna lilies can often grow as perennials in zone 7. The tea camellia does really well in zone 7 because of the warmth of the zone. and many other different plants. Of course, we had to put in the Clemson spineless okra as well in there, being that it's in Clemson. And Genesis is our own herb garden too, so we set that up as well. So for zone 8, whoops, getting a little ahead of myself there. So zone 8, we had a hypothetical landscape in Athens, Georgia. And this landscape had things like American holly, tulip poplar, the southern magnolia, sugarberry trees. It's a little bit warmer, so your annuals are going to last longer. Your perennials are going to bloom much longer down here. And you could also get away with some more tropical plants as well. So zone 8 is kind of a turning point with a lot of plants because it's kind of a border between plants that are more liking longer periods of warmth and the end of plants that need a period of cold. And then we have an example landscape in Jacksonville, Florida. So this is where you can do some more truly tropical things like avocados and bananas and alongside plants like the chase tree or sweet bay magnolia. Pomegranates for sure can grow down in zone 9. Alongside the native things like the asters. And you could do artichokes for sure really well for a long period down there. So there's a much longer list because there's a longer growing season here. Also, the property happens to be a bit bigger. So where do I find some design theme inspirations? I think of local ecosystems. I think of regional design cues, meaning that I'm looking at the architecture, I'm looking at the neighborhoods. And of course, that proceeds, followed by the architectural design of the houses or buildings. I look at neighborhoods. I look at model homes. If there's an opening or I'm allowed to go to a home that's on display, I will go look at the landscape there. Oftentimes, historic garden weeks are a great source of inspiration. Magazines and books, of course, online articles. Carolina Farm Stewardship Association, I'm sure, has plenty of resources. Mother Earth News is a good resource as well. I also go to nurseries. I take the students out to go to nurseries to look at the plant material we have available around us. And oftentimes the students will come with a plant from the field trips, so that's always fun. And I also consider what's in the landscape, what's appealing to me. Maybe I have something in my family history that I want to plant, like grandmother's roses or irises. Then you want to also think about designing a style. There are many ways to do this. And I've listed a couple in my book. There's the traditional, what I consider traditional heritage landscape design style. So these are the ones, there are 16 of these that are frequently sought out in our modern landscapes. You have the formal landscapes, kind of, again, remember the estate gardens. You can also have informal landscapes, which are more like an English cottage garden. And then specifically drawing inspiration from that in the English cottage garden style. Asian landscapes can be a great source of inspiration. They're more meditative, they're simplistic. You're thinking about being one with nature. And also, they're serene and they're very reflective. There are very few elements, and particularly when you think about a Japanese garden, you have a couple pagodas, maybe a bridge, a koi pond, some stones, and a few plants. So it's not chock full like an English cottage garden. Mediterranean gardens in a more warmer or drier region could be a source of inspiration. And specifically Tuscan landscapes, they have the wood and the wrought iron and stone as a dominant feature. So plants in these landscapes you're thinking about like oregano, thyme, lavender, things that like a Mediterranean style climate. Cloister gardens are a good monasteries are a good source of inspiration for this. Then you have the French potager garden, which is kind of like a more upscale and more organized cottage garden. Is the best way I could describe it off the cuff. A lot of people like this garden. They love the idea of bean poles mixed in with their petunias or some sort of native wildflower like mist flower. And you have the contemporary design, which is more modern, a little more on the emphasis on the steel and stone and concrete and modern materials, maybe even fiberglass. Pretty simplistic, pretty organized and orderly. It kind of follows the line of modern art. Maybe you want to do a natural landscape following the natural contours of the land, more like a park, or maybe more like a national park. In the Southeast, we can do xeriscaping. There's a home in Salisbury, North Carolina that has this sort of feel to it. It's kind of a Spanish adobe home with apunta, or the apuntia, which is a Latin name for prickly pear cactus, the sort of the pad, the cactus that has like a pad-like structure. And that, to do the more xeriscape southwestern style garden, you're going to have to think about good drainage for that, and also plants that can tolerate very dry and hot conditions. You can do tropical landscapes, and not necessarily, you don't need to have necessarily bananas and avocados and things like that to do that. You could do that even up in the upper parts of the South. You could do things with figs and canna lilies and sort of get that same sort of sense of a tropical garden. And of course, native plants as well, doing a full native plant garden. Also, getting inspiration from colonial Williamsburg. For a time, there was this emphasis on colonial gardens. The Victory Garden, I always like to use that for community gardens as a sense of inspiration. And some design inspirations you can use. Think about the earth, like terraces, slopes, rock gardens, and xeriscaping, stream beds. Water-based concepts like water gardens, bog gardens, wetlands. Woodland gardens for shade. You may have dry or wet shade. And urban conditions, such as indoor gardens, container gardens. If you don't have room for a traditional garden in the ground, you want to think ecology. Maybe you want to do a hugelkultur garden or a Chinampas garden if you want to do something challenging. Maybe you want to do alley cropping or intercropping. And then wildlife, of course, that would be getting inspiration from nature itself, and Zen gardens and moon gardens for contemplation. And you want to also think about sustainability. Don't forget about your rain barrels, your solar panels, how you're going to reduce waste through recycling or reusing cardboard boxes for a lasagna garden, enriching your soil or repurposing things. So now we're going to switch to the last chapter. So this last chapter, chapter 3, I'm going to quickly run through this, and we can have more questions and answers to this later. But this basically shows you some of the theories in practice. So what I encourage you to do for chapter 3 is, if you haven't bought the book, we've basically gone through each of, there's 25 of them to look at, and you can get your own inspiration from this, as well as you can talk to me about how they were done and what our pitfalls and successes were with these 25 projects. And hopefully they will cover many different issues you may have in Landscape. So that's chapter 3. So that's the book. I know that was a long sort of session there, but I hope you have had a enjoyable time with me going through the book. I encourage you to read a little further into the designs. I could go through them with you. I can go through them with you and more in depth in the Q&A session we will have on November the 11th. And maybe you could ask some questions about each one of those projects. How did Genesis and I develop this project? Sometimes it was me, sometimes it was Genesis, sometimes it was both of us. And we can go through each one of those if you would like, and we can talk about those when we have the Q&A session, which will be on November the 11th. And I look forward to talking more with everybody, and I hope this was an enjoyable session. All right. Well, with that, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you at the Q&A session when it comes time for that.